Is that the name? All right, so it's not moving. Oh, actually, it is moving. All right, let's go to getting responses a little bit. Now let's go with big screen, big speaker, and we'll just have to film it like that. All right, and and these sizes. And see, click, but yeah, we are now going. But yeah, we're going now.
We're going? All right.
Best we can do.
Do it live. Everyone ready? Welcome. Sorry, it's starting a little bit late. A little bit of technical problems. Welcome. This is Alice Goes Deeper, Redirection 2.0. Similar to the talk I gave last year, a little bit longer, but I added some things in. It was originally titled Alice and Exploit Redirection Land. Alice in Wonderland theme. Let's go ahead and get started. My name is Nathan Magniez. I'm an instructor with Art of Exploitation, powered by TCS. We primarily do training. My background's in pen testing, red teaming, and incident response. Let me go ahead and try to speed through that a little bit. I also work with Hackers for Charity as well. Some things I like. Skateboarding doesn't work out too well sometimes. So in this talk, we're going to go ahead and go over the very basics of what's needed for redirection, and we're going to talk about how to send our exploit packets through to our main target and then remain anonymous so we don't get caught as well. We're going to have go over some of the common terminology and definitions of redirection, what it's labeled as. We're also going to talk about the 5 W's, the who, what, when, where, and why, and how to do it. We're also going to have a demo of an exploit situation. All right, so some of the common terms with redirection. Some people call it pivoting, some people call it tunneling, jump point, whatever you want to call it. It pretty much means basically the same thing. It's basically a proxy. And what a proxy does, at its simplest definition, is accepts a header, strips a header, adds their header, and sends it on to the next destination. So from, if I'm surfing out to Google or at hunting.com, here I have the Tor browser up. I connect to the Tor network. I'm part of a whole bunch of Tor nodes. I send my packets off to that node. It goes somewhere else, in Canada, then the UK, then to Germany, and then finally out to my website there, and grabs HTML, right? So from the perspective of whoever's hosting that, it looks like whoever was my last hop was the one that did that. Same thing here, doing it through Netcat, found a random proxy on the internet, connecting out to that machine. I think it's in Brazil on port 3128, and grabbing the HTML. Instead of doing a standard GET request, I'm telling it to go out and get that website as well and give me the HTML. So I'm basically just utilizing something as a patsy. All right, so why do we want to use redirection? Well, it's pretty straightforward, right? Anybody that uses Tor browser or anything like that, you want to be anonymous, right? You don't want to be known on the internet. You don't want to have it track back to you. You also use it to bypass security controls as well. Get around firewalls, ACLs, stuff like that, where we can't get standard packets in. So let's say we're doing an in-map scan. We have a target out there. We're scanning them. First of all, we don't want them to know it's us that's scanning them. And then we also want to see what other ports are open that we can't see from an external situation. So if I'm scanning for SMB, any firewall or router out there should be blocking any access from an external source into an internal target on those type of ports, hopefully. So some of the things we could do is use it to bypass security controls and remain anonymous. All right, so we're going to talk about mainly running our exploits through these proxy chains. We'll also cover some of those scanning situations as well. All right, so exploitation without redirection. So it's just us out on the internet. We want to go ahead and hack someone, right? I send it off. Like I said, I was trying to, let's say, hack either LDAP or SMB. The firewall's in my way between me and that internal host, and I can't get my stuff through, right? The firewall's there, it blocks my access, and I can't get through. Sometimes, let's say, that's the domain controller on that network, right? That's primarily what we're after. We want to get him, or he has some sort of intel on him that we want. 9 times out of 10, you're not going to be able to get to your your exact target on the first try, right? So you're going to have to go ahead and start hopping your way through that network, maybe with some of the low-hanging fruit, perhaps a DMZ web server. Get on there, and let's say we own that machine, we can tell it to go ahead and accept our packets and send them on into that internal target as a trusted host. So let's say we own a DMZ web server. And on that machine, I have backdoor access. I put up a tool, and I tell it to go ahead and accept my packets and then redirect them on. Once you've been on this box here, the DMZ web server, you can go ahead and enumerate into the network. Let's say we use like hping to go ahead and send packets in and see what is trusted from this guy as part of that network that we can't get as the attacker from an external situation. All right, so we've used hping, and we've determined that our exploit, we had to aim it at port 389, or that's what it has to end up at with LDAP. From him, we've determined that we can get through the firewall from the DMZ web server to that internal host out there on 389, but not from us as an attacker. So on this machine, we put a redirector. We tell him to accept our packets and forward them on into that internal box. So what this is doing right now is I'm attacking on port 443. He's listening on 443 and accepting any packets that come to him on my behalf and redirect them on into that internal host. So just like a proxy would if you go to hidemyash.com or something like that, it's the same principles here that we're talking about. All right, so another concern is about logging. You don't want to be in logs, obviously, that's one of the benefits what we're talking about here. But especially if you have a whole bunch of machines in between you and your in target, correlation is a nightmare. So it's going to be really hard for, if you have a whole bunch of redirectors in between you and your in target, to actually have it correlated back to you. Attribution is a really hard task. Not to mention that a lot of end-user systems don't even keep logs. Also, if you're using multiple redirectors in different countries that don't work well together, that's another situation that might be to your benefit as well. All right, so how do you find your initial proxy, right? Because you have to talk to somebody at some point. So that's kind of a different talk entirely. But the short answer is that you can nmap scan for well-known proxy ports. There's online resources out there. We'll cover some of those in a little bit. You can get an anonymous VPN subscription. Previously hacked machines that are no longer worth anything for you, and you're just utilizing them as a patsy. So at some point, you're going to have to talk to somebody, right? That's just the nature of the game. You're going to have to take some risk when you're doing a red team or a pen test. All right, so automatic redirection. A lot of people ask why I even learn this the hard way. Because X, Y, and Z pen test tool will do this for me. Right-click, pivot, keep on going down the line. But sometimes you may find yourself in a situation where you don't have access to those tools or you don't have the funds, and you need to learn how to do things the manual method through the command line, using simple tools that we can show you how to do this with, such as SSH as well. Learn things the hard way, that way you don't have to rely on the auto magic, cool tool way. All right, so what do we need to do? What do we need to actually do this with? We're going to go ahead and need some sort of tool that does this proxying for us, right? Redirecting our packets for us. And I call this the two messengers, one to come, one to go. That's basically what our redirector is going to do for us. It's going to go ahead and take our packets, send them off, and then accept the packets on the return path and bring them back to us. All right, so the tool we're going to talk about is called data pipe. As the name implies, it's going to pipe data, and that's just what we're talking about, right? It's bidirectional TCP traffic, so you only have to set it up once on that machine. So in the example that we had before, the hacked DMZ web server, we just put one data pipe on him, tell him what port to listen on, where to send it to. He'll take care of the return traffic, because that's his job. It's a persistent process, so it will not die off the minute you use it. You'll have to go in there and manually kill it. It's also Windows and Unix compatible. There's a .exe and there's a Unix variant as well. And you cannot, just like with a netcat listener, you cannot bind to a port that's actively in use. So in the previous example, we said to listen on 443. We determined that didn't have 443 running. So if you try to listen on a port, just like with netcat that's already running, you'll get the can't bind to that port error code. And we use this just like we talked about to remain anonymous, and in those situations to redirect around firewalls or security controls to get to your end target. The usage is pretty simple. It's down here at the bottom, but I'll cover it more in the next slide. It's originally from jeffbovine.net/datapipe. So here's the syntax for DataPipe. It's relatively simple, and just like any command line syntax, you can think of it as an imperative statement. DataPipe, I want you to go ahead and listen on this interface, on this machine, on this specific port, and then redirect it off to another target. So just like when we fire up our web browser and go to hidemyass.com, we tell him where to go, right? Some website that you don't want them to know that you're surfing to, right? So here we have DataPipe, local interface, 0.0.0.0, so any interface that you have, listen on 443, and then redirect it off to 192.168.0.65 on port 139. So again, another situation like a NetBIOS port where we need to get around and firewall. Everyone with me so far? Okay. So it's pretty simple and straightforward. This is the tool that you would have to put up on the machine that you want to redirect for you, right? There's other tools that can do it like SSH where you can do it remotely, but that's a little bit harder to teach at this type of level for people. So in redirection, here's what it would look like from the command line in that same situation that we just had. So we have a hacked web server. I know it's a little small font up there with redirector. This is our back door onto this box. I put up my tool set. I go ahead and run DataPipe and tell them to do exactly the same thing. Start/B, started in the background. DataPipe.exe on any interface 0.0.0.0, 443, on to my internal target of 10.10.10.70 on port 389. Hit enter, double check NetStat, make sure it's listening. It is. Send my attack through. It gets into our internal target where we have another shell hopefully waiting for us again. Everyone good so far? Any questions? All right, so let's talk about an exploitation scenario. In this example, we're going to have a Windows 2000 domain controller that we've identified out there. We have a hacked DMZ web server like we just talked about. We have an in-stream firewall of some sort blocking our access into that internal box. We already own this machine, so we have physical command line access to it. Excuse me, not physical, remote access to it. All right, so we're going to go ahead and upload the exploit to that machine, the DMZ web server, and exploit that internal target since you can get our packets through. If we're successful, we still have to check our shell, right? And that's where we're going to need the redirector. We're going to put the redirector on that box, and then tell it to go ahead and redirect to that internal machine on the port we specify for our exploit code, and then check our shell. It's really small. Okay, so what's going on here is I'm on the remote box. I go ahead and start a DataPipe up top. I tell it to listen on the interface of 27.102 on port 8080, and then go ahead and redirect to 27.107, who is the domain controller, on port 1427. All right, that's going to be for our listener, for our exploit code. Here we also have an exploit. It's called DCOM. It's going to go off and exploit that machine. So this is from the web server. I point it at the internal box. I tell it to exploit the DC. Listen on port 1427. And if it's successful, go ahead and bind the shell to that port, 1427, which we just told DataPipe to redirect to so we can check that shell. So we go ahead and hit enter. It says we can now connect to the remote computer on the port you specified. So now, how do we check our shell? Well, from our attack machine, we're going to go ahead and connect to that 1427 on the web server. We should then redirect it on to the internal domain controller, right? So just like a proxy. All right, so I connect to that internal machine. I'm in. I hit 8080. He's listening on 8080, and he then redirects me into the domain controller on port 1427, where if our exploit was successful, we should have a shell waiting for us. It pops us a shell. Do an IP config just to verify where we're at. And we can see right here it's 27.107, so it's our domain controller, right? So we're in. And that was relatively easy, right? But can anyone see the flaw in what just occurred in that particular scenario? We got root, we got system, we're on that box, we got a shell. What's that? You track back to us. But where do we put our exploit code at? On that DMZ web server, right? Which we own, quote unquote, but we don't have physical access to it, right? We lost physical control of our exploit code. We put it up on that web server, which could be on the other side of the world, right? Somebody could pull the plug on it, see that they got hacked, and then we lost our exploit code, which wouldn't really matter for an old exploit like MS-08067, right? Because it's well known, or DCOM in this example. But what if it's like a 0-day exploit that you have a dev shop working on, right? And you've now lost physical access to that shell, to that exploit code. We don't want to do that. So this presents another layer of complexity. What we want to do is not lose physical access of our exploit code. We want to keep it here on our attack target, our attack machine, and then attack that internal machine. And we can do that by just adding some more data pipes. And that's where it kind of gets a little hairy. So we have a DCOM exploit, and it's going to go ahead and attack port 135. We already know that we can't get SMB ports past that firewall to that internal target. We have this machine that we own, and we know he can access those internal ports, right? So we have a Windows attack host, the compromised DMZ host, and a domain controller. So if I try to exploit him directly, it's going to get denied. So I need to go ahead and start setting up data pipes. In the previous scenario, we did that, but we lost physical access. We want to keep it here on Alice's computer. So we have a DMZ host. It's a Windows box as well. And what did I say about data pipe binding to ports that are already in use? We can't do it, right? So I can't set up a data pipe on him to tell it to listen on 135 to then redirect off to the other machine on 135. So I have a Unix attack host here. It's going to go ahead and accept my packets. I'm going to put a data pipe on him since he's not utilizing SMB ports and tell him to accept packets on 135 and then redirect them off to that other machine. So tell him to listen. All right, tell him to listen on 135. Tell him to redirect to 1350 on the compromised host. Tell the compromised host to listen on 1350 and redirect to 135 on an internal target. Oops. All right, so then I can now send off my exploit onto the domain controller and ride the data pipe chain. So I send DCOM to my Unix attack host who's listening on 135. It sends it off to the compromised host and onto the domain controller, where if everything's successful, I should have a shell, according to my DCOM exploit, on port 1070 here on that remote machine. So I hacked him. He's got my shell up there. There's all my data pipes again. And now I got to check my data pipe. So I need another data pipe to go ahead and check that shell because I still can't talk to him directly. So then I go ahead and use netcat to go ahead and call into him. Netcat to port 1070 on the compromised host. And it's going to go ahead and redirect it off to 1070 on the domain controller, where if our exploit was successful, we should have a shell waiting for us, right? So that's a little bit more complex than what we had before, but it allows us to maintain physical control of our exploit code. Does that make sense? Did you have a question on that?
Yeah, data pipe.
Yes.
How is it?
What was that?
Data pipe. You're basing this on data pipe.
Yeah.
How is it with AV?
How's it with AV?
Yeah.
I don't think it's been picked up. It's basically just a port redirector. I wouldn't use it in a legitimate scenario, though. We use this mainly to teach with. The syntax is simple, and it illustrates the concept fairly well. There's lots of other things you can do. We'll cover those too. We do this with SSH as well. So, all right. So this is what basically happened in our redirection attack. We tried to attack. We couldn't get through. We then had the Unix attack host because we have to aim our exploit code at 135. We set up a listener on him. We put another data pipe on the compromised host to accept those packets again. So another data pipe chain, and then send on to the domain controller, ultimately on port 135 on the domain controller. We then attacked our Unix attack host, which actually just sent the packets right on through to the domain controller on the other end of the data pipe chain. Where if everything was successful, we had a shell waiting for us, we set up another data pipe connected in, bing, bang, boom, we're on that box, and we're only 3 data pipes in, right? But that's kind of also another layer of complexity too. So in that previous scenario, we only had 3 data pipes, not too hard, but we also went wrong there as well a little bit too, because we talked directly to our target as well, not compromised host, right? So we still had a direct connection to our web server. We don't want that, obviously, so that presents a scenario where you're going to need some more redirectors, and it's going to get hairy. So if they have logs, they're going to log it, they're going to see it, it's going to point right back to your attack machine. We need some more steps in between us. So I call this the rule of 3. Having 3 redirectors in between you and your ultimate in target for a red team. So another redirection host. Alright, so here we have our ultimate in target of the DC, but we also have the compromised host, right? So we don't want to talk directly to him too. So we want to have 3 redirectors in between us and them. So in this scenario, it can get pretty hairy pretty fast, right? And this looks relatively simple on display, but from a command line perspective, it can get pretty hairy, especially if you have limited real estate, right? On your screen here, and you're working in a GUI, command line and not the GUI. All right, so we have multiple redirectors going on, one for our exploit codes and one to check our shell. That way we're not directly talking to our compromised host out here, the DMZ web server. We never want to directly connect to them. We're going to go ahead and ride 3 different chains on into that target network. Does that make sense? All right. So what does that scenario look like from the command line? Because we can't point and click our way through this. We're going to have limited real estate to deal with, especially if you're remote and you're just working with a laptop, no external monitors, nothing like that. We have this much space to work with, and we have a lot of command line windows to go ahead and set those data pipes up, right? And it's going to get kind of hairy too, because you're going to forget which command line is doing what on which machine on which side of the earth. So I recommend usually with students or anybody actually go ahead and set up a whole bunch of machines, and then go ahead and change the background color to something obnoxious like red, because it hurts your eyes to look at. And you know this machine is only used for redirection, right? If I see red, don't do anything else on it. It's just a redirector machine. Also, rename the not the machine itself, but that would kind of give give yourself away a little bit. This is just for instruction here. So Linux redirector, go ahead and you can go ahead and change the name, but that wouldn't be good. We're setting up our data pipes there. That was the first hop. On your Windows machines on your local side, you can go ahead and change the title. So this is the redirector number 2. Also change the background color. Set in the second set of data pipes. Number 3, same thing, change the title, make it red. And then finally the compromised host, our first victim on that target network. Rename him compromised DMZ host. And then this is our local attack host. And then make it something nice and pleasant with that, like I like the gray. Go ahead and change his title. That way we don't actually type the wrong command in the wrong terminal window. So here we're running that DCOM exploit. We're pointing at the Unix IP address. It's going to ride that daisy chain of proxies on in and into that internal target. Everyone with me so far? All right. Any questions? All right. So I know I went through that kind of fast. Let's see. I recommend, just like we had with Alice and all the crazy data pipes, draw it out logically like a roadmap. That's how I like to think about it. know exactly what commands you need to enter on those machines ahead of time before you're on that box running them. So you don't want to mess up and then actually redirect into yourself or back into another machine. I've seen students have redirection chains that just go point right back into themselves, and they hit the exploit, and then they actually exploit, but they don't. They're exploiting themselves. All right, so what else can we do with redirection? Well, anything, right? It's that simple proxy again. So we can connect to network shares. We can surf the web or corporate internets. Shell reverse shells back out to us. In that previous scenario, we had a listening shell bound to that internal target. We can also tell it, hey, what if this exploit is going to shell out? We need to set up redirections for that to come back, receive the backdoor callbacks. The only thing that's a caveat there is you have to make sure every pipe is set up correctly. And that there are some other complexities that could happen. Any machine in between you and your in target, that's a potential problem for something to go on, right? The internets can go down, a router can go down somewhere and break your chain, right? So even if you have it set up, it's possible that it might not work. So don't get discouraged about it, but just make sure that you know, if you have 18 redirectors, one of them could go down and screw everything up for you. Some online resources for proxies. There's hidemyass.com. They have a free IP and port proxy list. It's relatively fuzzy up here. I can't see it all either. But basically, you can go ahead and tell it to select, show you the anonymity level, show you which ones you want, what type of traffic it supports, what ports you want. It will show you where they're located and what country, how reliable it is, how fast it is, the connection time, and the anonymity level. There are some high anonymity levels. They recommend not to go to the highest because most likely those are probably honeypots. So here we're also scanning for well-known proxy ports, like I mentioned before. So basic nmap scan. We're going out. We're looking for port 3128 for SQUID, 1080 and 8080, and then we're scanning a particular range and finding any that come back to us. Here we see one that's open, and then you can test that proxy just like we did in the example at the very beginning by connecting out to it with netcat and telling it to get a web page for you. And then if it returns the web page for you, you know it's a good proxy. And you keep moving on. Once you have a whole bunch of proxies accumulated, whether it's from finding them online or previously hacked machines that are dead to you now, you can go ahead and set them up in a proxy chain to go ahead and string them together for you to run like nmap scans through. Proxychains.conf is one of those tools. Basically, you're just going to tell it what proxies you have, what type they are, and what ports that they're listening on. You tell proxychains how many you have, and then where you want to send them off to. You can set a strict list of proxies, or you can set a dynamic list if you want. Typically, probably use a strict. So here we're using proxy chains to run nmap scans. We told it to go ahead and utilize probably 2 or 3. Nmap scan on down the line, and basically the way you use it, you just say proxy chains and then whatever command you want to run after. And it goes ahead and sends that command on through those proxy chains automatically for you. All right, so there's other redirection tools out there, but DataPipe is the easiest to learn on. The syntax is really simple, straightforward. It's not as complex as SSH, where you're actually on your local system SSHing into a remote system and then setting it up that way. There's also SOCAT and FPipe as well. FPipe also has the benefit of spoofing a source port, which could be beneficial to you as well. And there's also a tool called iPivot, and it will kind of step you through with a Python script of some of those. So here we have pivot via SSH, or pivot via proxy chains, or pivot via netcat. We're going to go ahead and use SSH as an example. So we do selection number 1, and then it steps you through that guided list. So you'd have to do this for each machine on that list of 3 that we had before. Do this scenario 2. So you go ahead and select selection number 1, You tell it what local port would you like to use. This is the local port of the redirector machine. So 1390. What is your target's IP address? That's the next hop, or the next redirector, or your in target, depending on where you're at on the redirection chain. You tell it it's the next IP address, and then where is it ultimately going to go? What port? In this scenario, we're going to go ahead and send it off to in target, so 139. What user will you be leveraging the pivot as? This is who you're logging into the redirector machine as. In this case, root. The thing goes off, asks you for the IP address of that machine, that's the redirector. And then it basically just SSHs into that box and sets up that SSH scenario for you, or the proxy chain scenario that we saw before. I recommend generally, when you're talking about redirection, to do this in a lab environment. Set it up, put a whole bunch of virtual machines together, and just start setting up redirectors on them, and then just start redirecting on through each other or onto different boxes, and just start to learn the in and outs of it, because it can get kind of confusing, especially on that limited real estate through the command line. Especially recommend drawing it out in that roadmap format as well. That helps to make things a lot easier. Does anyone have any questions? All right. That's the end, I guess. So, general props, company, art of exploitation, telecommunication systems. Also, please support Hackers for Charity. They need your help. Anybody have any questions?
Do you have any tips on preventing like information leakage outside of the proxies? So like, you know, if you end that the proxy chains, when I forget to stop paying, you can ping outside of the proxy.
Yeah, so sometimes with tools like InMap, I think that there's a certain scenario where it won't send the ping through the proxy chain, and it'll be pinging directly from your assistant. So there are scenarios like that, and basically I would always test in a lab environment first and see with a packet capture where the leakage is coming from. That way you can see.
Sometimes I've set up IP tables too that just block in direct connections to that target host. That way you just stop all leakage.
Okay. Did anyone see the Raspberry Pis at our booth earlier? All right. If you guys look on the back of your chair, there should be an AOE sticker on one of them. If it's yours, you won the pie. We got one. All right. No other questions? Offline? I'll be available. I'm the guy on the scooter with the pirate